Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this special conversation. We're coming together this evening to discuss the film Ain't No Back to a Merry-Go-Round, a powerful and timely story that sheds light on a lesser known but important chapter in the struggle for civil rights, told through the voices of those who lived it. We're honored to be joined today by the film's director, Ilana Trachtman. Ilana is an Emmy Award-winning director-producer for over 25 years. She has created programs for numerous networks, including PBS, HBO, ABC, Showtime, Discovery, Lifetime, and the Sundance Channel. Ilana believes that true stories, carefully told, have unique power to inspire compassion, action, and community building. Her topics have ranged from the legacy of slavery in Latin America to Gulf Coast shrimpers, glass blowing for at-risk youth, to transgender parents. Today, she'll share with us insights into the film Ain't No Back to a Merry-Go-Round, including what drew her to the story, how she portrayed the narratives, and how its themes continue to resonate today. As always, feel free to go ahead and start submitting your questions now via the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. And with that, I'd like to welcome Ilana to join us to begin the conversation.
Thanks so much. I just first want to thank the Haberman Institute. It's an honor to be speaking to you guys. And I actually grew up with Rabbi Haberman as my rabbi, so I'm even especially moved to be speaking to you. I am open to any questions, but I'll just start out to get us rolling by answering the question that I most often get first. And that is why and how I came to be making this film, rather than making a film about anything else. And the reason is because I actually grew up in the area. I grew up in Rockville and went to Washington Hebrew. And Glen Echo was, it was a destination of my childhood. It was a place that my family went often. I was very captivated by the wreckage, really. That's what it was in the 70s of the amusement park. And there was at that time still roller coaster tracks in the ground, and the shooting gallery was still there. And it had this, aura that was almost pregnant, I would say, like with like these ghosts of people who had been thrill seeking. And I had neighbors who had gone there as children. I knew somebody whose grandparents got engaged on the Ferris wheel. And, to me, it was a symbol of a kind of simpler, more wholesome Washington. Um, and it wasn't until about 20 years actually after I moved away. I went to college and I was back because I brought my then fiance to see Glen Echo because I loved it so much and I thought we should consider it as a wedding venue. And I should also say that probably even more than most kids, I spent a lot of time looking at those pictures that were all over the park at the time, of the old-fashioned dresses and people like there was pictures of Navy sailors like throwing their girlfriends up in front of the carousel right after World War One. And so I had the sense of what it looked like. And it wasn't until we came back, and this would have been in like 2009 or something, um, that we met probably the only Orthodox Jewish park ranger in the National Park Service, who told us the story of how Glen Echo Park became integrated. And that was really shocking for me because I was first stopped on this question. Like, what do you mean Glen Echo Park had to be integrated? Like, it had never occurred to me that this place that I had so idealized was, in fact, whites only. And in the way that I had fantasized about this wonderland was really only wonderland for white people. And in fact, was actually the opposite. If you were a person of color, it was a site of cruelty and it was a site of exclusion and rejection and meaningless rejection and rejection really of children. I mean, when you think about it, I mean, that's who is the most excited to go to an amusement park. So that was like a painful reckoning. and especially of like my own sort of ignorance of that, because I had been looking at those pictures and I just hadn't registered that I was only looking at pictures of white people. And growing up in the county, which obviously was integrated, I mean, I knew that there were communities of color, and so, I just hadn't made that connection. So I felt kind of complicit. And then as I started working on the film, which I didn't know was going to be a film yet, but started doing research about how it was that Glen Echo became integrated, and I learned about the Bannockburn community, I was really they felt very familiar to me because my dad, Les Trachtman, had been a Jewish labor organizer, and so the kinds of things that they were talking about, the the essays that were in the Bannockburn newsletter, the people that I spoke to all felt like family, they felt like people that could have been at our family's dinner table. And so that was another part of it. And that's where the whole thing began, and that was 10 years ago. Actually, 11 years ago now.
Great. Thank you for sharing your story of how it all began. And I'll start with a few questions. And I noticed that somebody hit the hand raise button. We're only taking questions through the Q&A button. It's kind of in between share and show captions on your screen. So if you can hit that button there and send your questions to us that way. Uh, so to get us started, I was wondering what responses have you received from different audiences, whether younger audiences or older audiences who might have some of whom, like yourself, would have been unfamiliar with the story. I grew up in Northern Virginia and had studied even civil rights and wasn't familiar with the story until seeing your film and hearing about it. So um,
I would say that probably 99% of my audiences are not familiar with the story, including people who are of an age that you would expect that they would have been. I think that for lots of reasons, it was forgotten history and maybe even suppressed history. Um, so it's pretty rare that I meet somebody, but I do sometimes. So it's pretty rare that I meet somebody who says, "Oh yeah, I remember that," and XYZ. Um, when I was working on the film and when I was like sort of coming close to having a fine cut, I did a lot of focus group testing. So it's not to say that I'm not surprised, but I really wanted to know before the film was finished how it was landing with different audiences. And so I tested it with teenagers. I tested it with civil rights veterans, with older African American people, older Jewish people, older Quakers, middle-aged people, teachers, activists, scholars, you name it. And I can't say by any means that there is a universal reaction. I mean, if there is something that everybody who watches it has in common, like they tend to be, first of all, like surprised, sort of like, how is it that this amazing historic experience happened and I didn't know? Inspired, grateful to know the story. Hopefully, moved to know about these unsung heroes. Um, yeah, I mean, I think probably personally, the most moving reactions for me is from people who are civil rights veterans who say to me either, yeah, that's what it felt like. Not that they weren't necessarily veterans of this protest. Maybe they protested in Minnesota or whatever, but they felt like, yeah, that that quality, that texture of the times is in fact how it felt, which is, the biggest challenge. And then another reaction that I've really appreciated is from people who were part of the protest but were really little, who were kids at the time. And so who have said to me, you know, I didn't really have a context. I didn't really understand everything that was going on around me. I didn't understand how this thing that my mother said we should do was part of, a larger movement and a larger socio-political climate. And that's also been really gratifying to be able to give that to people.
Thank you. Yes, and so, following up from, identifying people who, who were there at the time or had some experience with it, and how did you go about discovering those individuals who had a personal experience with the movement, or and the footage itself that you shared with us? How did you come across all that?
Yeah, the research for this film was intense, incredibly laborious, um, because it wasn't earmarked as history at the time that it was happening or even, afterwards. So it's not like, if you were going to do a film about the March on Washington, you could type in March on Washington on Google and you'll get, a ton of images and footage. And there was nothing like that. And so what I had to do is reconstruct it from well, I started with every piece of published ephemera that I could find. And so in those days, there was actually a ton of printed newspapers and newsletters, much, much obviously more than we have now because now it's all online. But there was like I think Washington, D.C. had something like 6 daily papers. Um, and that's not even including like the Afro-American and the Jewish Week. So it was tracking down all those papers, most of whom are out of print, so whether it was like microfiche or some of the really local papers, like county papers and neighborhood papers and things were like in church basements and reading everything from early June of 1960 through 1961, cover to cover, looking for references. And so the references gave names and people gave quotes, and I was tracking those people down. The women were really hard to find because they were young and they weren't married yet. And in those days, when you got married, you absolutely changed your name. And so, however they were identified in the newspaper article wasn't going to be how I was going to find them. So that was like, I guess probably more than anything, it was like following rumors. Um, this person remembered that this person might have been, at dental school in this particular school at this particular time. And so it was like going through alumni offices and literally phone books from in libraries. And, in some ways, the footage was a similar process. I spoke to probably about 150 people who had been there. I mean, basically anyone that I could find who had been there, even as a child, I spoke to. And just tried to capture whatever memories they could give me to essentially before anything else like create the full picture of who was there, who came on what day, at what particular time did this conversation happen, on which day of the week was it that the protest stopped at 9 o'clock at night rather than 11 o'clock because there was a thunderstorm, like all of those kinds of things. And like I have this huge notebook that has like the breakdown of everything. Like there's a divider for each day of the protests. And like, it's all in there, how every single newspaper covered it on that particular day. Um, and I mean, letters to the editor, the way that people signed them, I was finding those people. And for the footage, it was also like rumors of rumors of rumors. And when I started, I mean, I would say every single piece of moving footage of the protest that's in the film is a singular miracle. I mean, really, like when I began, I didn't have any footage of the protest at all. And I mean, there's stories that I've told many times. I'll tell a story that I haven't told before, which is there's one piece of footage of the protest that's maybe 15 seconds. And 15 seconds is so valuable. And the way that footage came to be because sometime in the maybe 20 years ago, a park ranger at Glen Echo was giving a tour of the park and mentioned the fact that it had been how it had been integrated in these protests. And there was a woman on the tour who was, I believe, French, and she was visiting Washington. She said, my parents took us here the summer of 1960. And my dad had a camera and was filming our trip to Washington. And I know we came here. I wonder if he filmed the protests. So she went back to France, she lived in France, and went through that film footage and found that her father had indeed, because it was so unusual to see protesters in front of an amusement park, her father had spent 15 seconds panning over the protesters, and then they went into the park and he filmed his kids on the carousel and on the merry-go-round and eating ice cream and things like that. And so she went back to France and she actually mailed that piece of footage to the park ranger, who took it and put it in the National Park Service storage unit, which is like somewhere out in Virginia. And then one ranger told another ranger who told me about this and that it existed. But then I had to spend 3 years stalking the National Park Service to have somebody, they wouldn't let me, of course, go to the storage unit, to have somebody go to the storage unit and find it. And I mean, it got to a point where I was actually like threatening to sue them because, it was like, this is taxpayer dollars that you're storing this with. And, whoops, you need to share this with me. And so, that's how I got that particular piece of footage. And also all of the footage pre 1960 and pre is silent. So that's a whole nother thing about sort of recreating the soundscape to it. So, I mean, if people are interested, I'm happy to talk about more of these incredible stories, but it was all just sheer luck and perseverance.
Yeah, that's really an amazing story that as those pieces came together. And I imagine it was difficult. In a completely different genre, I heard the first Super Bowl was even edited over, and there's no copies that exist of the first Super Bowl. So I imagine finding a protest,
Right.
at Glen Echo is only that much more difficult. So it's really
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah,
Uh,
and that's right. I mean, for people who don't realize that, is that like tape was expensive. And so everything was taped over. You recycled everything. I mean, I'm sure people knew, say at Kennedy's assassination, that that was historic and they saved that particular footage. But, I bet whatever the news story that happened right before it of, you know, I don't know, a kidnapping or a local election or something, that there is no record of it that exists anymore.
yeah, exactly. Were all of the people you try to contact, were they willing to talk? Was it difficult to?
Um, The vast majority were really happy to talk about it, enthusiastic, I would even say, because they really hadn't ever, nobody had ever asked them about it. And so they were really happy to talk about it because it was formative. Um, there was a couple people who were like, well, why would you, who cares? Like, why is this interesting to you? And there was somebody that I actually had to spend many years, like, this man is a, what is he? Like a orthodontist, I think, or something like that. And I called his office many, many times. I got to know his secretaries. I was telling the receptionist in the orthodontic office, like, you know, you have to understand, Dr. So and so is actually like a hero, and and like, will you please tell him? And finally, like all the emails, all the calls, whatever, I finally wrote him, like I hand wrote him a letter longhand about why I wanted to interview him. And he finally said yes.
That's nice. I was wondering, did you try to, or was anybody open from like the American Nazi Party? There was that whole scene, and I wasn't sure if you have any stories to tell about that, those
Um,
rules.
I didn't pursue anybody from the American Nazi Party. Um, Mostly because they kind of weren't the point. I mean, they were like the enemy in a way. They sort of remained way more interesting as the faceless enemy than like to sort of go down the rabbit hole of their particular stories, which were complicated because I actually had somebody who was a scholar of the American Nazi Party who identified every single person for me who's in that footage and knew the backstory of every single one. And so, I knew who these people were, and they're all, as you can imagine, like really deranged from very, very horrific backgrounds. Um, there's somebody that I have footage of in there who's like often holding a sign that says like this like horrible caricature, and it says the head of the NAACP is a Jew. And he, in fact, turned out to have been um, grown up in an Orthodox Jewish family. And when the Washington Post outed him, this member of the American Nazi Party, that he was from an Orthodox Jewish family, he killed himself. Um, so, it was just like that's another movie. And it's not the kind of movie that I want to make because I don't see any hope in it. Um, But I will say that, when I first saw the footage of the Nazis, I don't know, it was probably 8 years ago or so, it was really shocking to see that footage. It was just, you know, I knew about the Nazis marching on Skokie, but that was like 10 years later. And the idea that like Nazis were marching just 15 years after the war in a community where there were survivors in my neighborhood, essentially, it was like unbelievable. But then, like, over time, I don't think I've gotten inured to it because I've seen the footage so much. I think I've gotten inured to it because, like, we saw it in Charlottesville. We've seen like they kind of look like boring white supremacists now. It's just it's a much more familiar sight, sadly.
Yeah, yeah, unfortunately, that's true in our
Yeah.
world today. Were there any stories or moments that you wish you had included, but you had to leave out?
Well, I don't know. I'm assuming that everybody who's on this call knows where the phrase the cutting room floor comes from. But just in case, the cutting room floor comes from the days when film was literally made on film. And when you were editing, you used a razor blade in order to cut pieces out and then scotch tape to tape pieces together. So you were cutting pieces out. And so the cutting room floor is where those pieces just fell onto the ground. And this film has a cutting room floor that's like 3 feet deep, that you would like have to wade through because there's so much that I had to leave out. Um, you know, it was that part of what made this film take so long was the editing process and deciding like what goes in and what doesn't go in, and where is the dome of this story. Where do I hold the beginnings and ends of this story? And just starting with character. And I easily could have told this film with 25 main characters, but as viewers, we cannot watch and also connect with 25 people in a 90-minute film. And 90-minute film is basically like the format, unless you're making a docuseries, and that's a whole nother um, fundraising challenge that I wasn't up for. But so just limiting it to basically four A characters, two B characters, and then there's kind of like a Greek chorus. And that meant there's lots of people that didn't get featured, whose stories are important and valuable. And I really hope someday that somebody writes a book about this, and I'm happy to give them lots of information because there's so much that I had to leave out.
There's a question here asking whether or not there's more information about why the Baker brothers changed their minds, if it was government pressure or Jewish organizations, or if this person asked if there was rabbis in the area, if you have more
Yeah.
to say about that piece of the story.
Yeah. Well, I'll start by saying like there's no evidence that any kind of Jewish institution took any position on this whatsoever. In fact, like I can't really say that they didn't know about it because it was covered in the Washington Post on the front page many times. So it was ignored. I mean, or turned the other cheek. But I mean, I went through the records of like the minutes of all of the synagogues that were within a 20-mile radius, the minutes of the sisterhood groups and the brotherhood groups and the board meetings and the sermons. Nobody mentioned it anywhere. There were not rabbis who were talking about this. And the Washington Jewish Week didn't do a single article on it that entire summer. So I can definitely say that rabbis and institutions are not the reason that the Baker brothers caved. Um, I believe what happened, and I say I believe rather than what I know happened, because I really feel like in creating this film, I was creating a primary text, and so therefore have an especially uh, especially burdensome responsibility to make sure that everything that's in the film is something that I could verify upwards and backwards and downwards. And so if somebody told me something that wasn't good enough to make it into the film, I had to be able to prove it. Um, and so what I believe happened is what the Washington Post reported, that there were talks, probably by people in Bannockburn who worked in the government, and But I say people, the most likely person was Hyman Bookbinder, who was a resident of Bannockburn. He became a major executive in the American Jewish Committee. And Hyman Bookbinder in 1960, with the new Kennedy administration, became the Assistant Undersecretary of Commerce. And he would have had the Attorney General's ear, who was Bobby Kennedy. Um, and likely his and Bobby Kennedy cared about civil rights. So it was likely that conversation that inspired Bobby Kennedy or one of his representatives to speak to the Baker brothers and say, listen, you are going to lose the lease on your parking lot, which is on federal land, if you don't integrate. And of course, you can't have an amusement park in the suburbs without a parking lot. Um, I also, went through, that's what Hyman Bookbinder said happened, and that's what Post reported. I went through all of Bobby Kennedy's diaries, like records, his what those days what they called secretary's diaries, um, engagement calendars, like looking for something like some scribble of like conversation with Abram Baker, telegram, something. There wasn't anything. Um, that certainly doesn't mean it didn't happen. It was probably a one-on-one conversation, but that's what I think happened. And and I'm sure that the publicity was not good for them. I don't know if yeah, I don't know necessarily that it was Bobby Kennedy himself placing a call to Abram Baker, or if it was some like underling's underling who talked to the manager of the park. I really don't know. But definitely at the end of the season of 1960, after all this took place, they were still saying that they were not intending at all to integrate. And then in March, they just changed their mind. And they never said why.
Thanks. There's a follow-up question that just came up. What this person's asking that you mentioned the parking lot is on federal property, and they're asking, wasn't all of Glen Echo on federal property?
No. Um, so Glen Echo was originally a Chautauqua institution, and the I'd have to sort of like show you the map about like where the boundaries are of it. It was a Chautauqua institution. It changed hands, but the land where the parking lot is on was originally Army Corps of Engineers land. And I don't know exactly like the bureaucratic which agencies it then went through, but it started out as Army Corps of Engineers, and it just wasn't part of the same parcel of land.
Thanks. Were there, you mentioned, the challenges of historical accuracy, and were there any other challenges of historical accuracy you faced, like in light of like an individual's like a sort of emotional storytelling? Um,
Yeah. 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 Oh my goodness. So much of that. So much of that because, you know, most people are not reliable narrators. Certainly, I mean, I couldn't tell anybody with 100% accuracy what I had for breakfast this morning, let alone a series of events that happened 60 years ago. I mean, 60 years ago, and I'm talking about it one particular, set of events. And so constantly, I mean, I'll tell you one story which is like so indicative. When I was doing my initial interviews, I went to go meet somebody who had been part of the sort of social group of kids, 18, 19-year-olds who were partying together, black and white. And when I reached out to her, I didn't tell her much, just that I was making this film and that the title of it was going to be Ain't No Back to a Merry-Go-Round, and just the general outlines, because you don't want to tell anybody too much information, or it's going to steer how they speak to you. So she's telling me about all kinds of things, and she was telling me about particular parties and her friend Stokely, and the time that Stokely jumped the turnstile and ran onto the carousel. And as the police were chasing him and he's running around the carousel, he's saying, well, where do you want me to sit? Because there ain't no back to a merry-go-round. There ain't no back to a merry-go-round. And like, I wish that happened. How cool would it be if that happened? What a great story, and what a great reason for the title. But like I can say like it almost 100% did not happen. I mean, starting with the fact that there wasn't a turnstile, and that Stokely never made it onto the carousel. And like whether or not he had Langston Hughes at his disposal, at his speaking disposable, I doubt it. So yeah, I mean, there was a lot, and there was even things that people who are in the film who who are the representatives, who are the storytellers. There was parts of their stories, things that they told me that I just couldn't use because um, either I couldn't verify it, or even more specifically, like I knew it was out and out untrue. Not that they were lying, but they weren't remembering it correctly.
Thanks. Yeah, that's completely understandable given the time. As you said, what we had for breakfast this morning can be hard enough.
Right.
So,
I
uh,
wanted to
I-
clarify something that came up before about the federal land. I don't know if this is the source of confusion, but obviously Glen Echo now is entirely federal land. It's a national park, and the reason for that is when the park was, or when the Baker brothers decided to close the park, they actually wanted to turn it into condominiums and build a development. And the neighborhood protested, the neighborhood of Glen Echo, in fact. And so when they couldn't sell the land anywhere, the Baker brothers turned to the federal government, who did a land swap. And the Baker brothers were given, I think, two townhouses somewhere in DC, and the park was given to the Department of the Interior.
think, yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Um, you just mentioned in your last story the title of your film, and somebody asked, how did you find the Langston Hughes poem?
I wish I can't take responsibility for it. So when I started working on this, like the only research of any import that had been done was there was somebody who had written a master's thesis at Morgan State, and somebody else had written like a junior year in college history paper, and someone else had written a children's play, and all of them were called Ain't No Back to a Merry-Go-Round. So, that was like, so I did not find it. But then, of course, when I did look it up, it just was incredibly apropos. And I actually really didn't want to title the film Ain't No Back to a Merry-Go-Round, because nobody knows what it means if you just hear it and you don't see the film. It's incredibly long and clunky. It does not roll off the tongue. And if you look at like anything that's on, say, Netflix or Amazon, the titles are usually two words or less, because in the thumbnail, that's all you can fit font-wise underneath it. And so I'm sure, like, should I ever be lucky enough to have this film picked up by one of those, they will make me change the title. But that's how it came to be.
I'll just follow, grabbing what you just said there. Are there headwinds or anything toward making it on a more
Yeah.
massive
Um,
scale?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do believe that at some point it will become, widely available streaming. But I don't think that's happening anytime soon. I mean, the natural home for this film is PBS. And as we all know, PBS is under threat. And even if it wasn't under threat financially, I don't know how safe it will be politically. I mean, and it's crazy to me that this film may be considered incendiary in some way, but of course, like, it does mention all the words that are taken out of all the government websites, like race and black and women and things like that. So and I don't know. I think that the bigger, like, streamers like Netflix and HBO have concern that it's too local a story, and that they don't know that it will be universally appealing. But I hope that we will have some limited theatrical showings in cities outside of Washington, where, of course, it's been doing really well, but outside of Washington, and that those will do well enough to signal to those streamers that they should pick it up.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah, it's that was one of the things that sort of surprised me about not knowing the story, just having studied so much of it myself. And I don't know, maybe because so much of the history surrounds certain big individuals like Martin Luther King Jr. and such that it doesn't have one of those names to go with it. But yeah, hopefully it'll reach a larger audience soon. So, um, do you want to say anything more about some of the visual styles? There was like different animation and music that you used.
Yeah. I mean, my goal for the film was to transport the viewer to 1960. And I didn't want people to be watching the film and think like, oh, this is a film and they're telling us about what happened in 1960. Like say, with all respect, I mean like a Ken Burns film where you're aware that you're sitting in your living room and he is delivering to you a very scholarly reflection on the history of baseball or something. I really wanted people to feel like this is what 1960 felt like. And so, first of all, I didn't use a narrator. Um, had I would have been done in much less time because it's much easier to tell a story with a narrator. So everybody who's in the film and the whole way that the story of the film moves is through the voices of people that were there. And so, there's no experts and there's nobody like commenting on it. Um, and so the responsibility for the storytelling is from these people who are in their 70s and 80s and 90s, and the exposition is coming from the newspapers of the day, which of course the mainstream papers are being read by Mandy Patinkin and the black press is being read by Jeffrey Wright, and of course the letters to the editor are expressing the public sentiment of that time, and that's also different celebrity actors, but when it came to music and it came to color palette and it came to fonts, like everything had to be authentic. So there are like no arrangements, no chordal arrangements that didn't exist at the time. um, and I have a brilliant composer. His name is Adam Dorn, and Adam's father Joel Dorn was one of the original R&B record producers, and so Adam grew up like at the knee of these incredible African American musicians who like I would say like are in his soul. So in a way it wasn't it, it was natural for him to be able to write this in a way that I don't think it would have been for somebody who didn't grow up like that. Um yeah, I mean all the fonts, they're all 1960 fonts, even the lower thirds are 1960 fonts. And the color effect, that animation is really like a response to a problem. And the problem is that I didn't have footage of everything. When Dion goes into the library and goes into the white stacks, there was nobody there with a camera, or at least if there was, I haven't met them yet. And so, or found that footage. And so, I needed to be able to represent it visually, but I didn't want to trick the audience. So I didn't want to pull one over on the audience by doing a recreation, which is, perfectly reasonable, but it's just not something that I wanted to do. I didn't want people to think like, oh, this is really him. Um, and I also didn't want to do like a regular animation, which is also another technique of, like a 2D or even 3D animation, because that was going to take you really out of the story. So I wanted you to stay in the story, but I also wanted to signal to the audience that this isn't exactly right. Like, this isn't real. This is memory. And so I was trying to embody the texture of memory, which is mushy and slippery and doesn't have edges and proportions are off and colors move, or, there's like a gradient quality about our memory. And so I took footage that was contemporaneous, that could have been Dion running in the playground away from the library, but it's not. And the reason it's not because it's blurry and it has a special color effect on it. So that is how that came about. And that was a lot of trial and error, but also like just incredible collaborators. I had a brilliant motion graphic designer whose name is Travis Hatfield, and that's Travis. That's absolutely Travis's work. And then also, I would be remiss not to talk about my editors, because if the film is any good, it's because I was working with Sandra Christie and Ann Collins, who are brilliant. And it was really, in a way, Sandra is African American and Anne is Catholic, and in a way, like the three of us, like we're almost like representing the picket line ourselves. And there was a lot of like push, like gentle, loving, incredibly constructive, but like educating each other about things that affected every single creative decision in the film. because there were perspectives that we each had that we also didn't have, you know.
Thanks. Yeah, I really appreciated that the way the way the story came across. I mean, at the time as I was watching, I didn't even think about there not being a narrative and sort of other documentary tellings, but you really do get the effect of the narrative. Um, there's a question here going back to the streaming. I'll read what the person said here. So many of the characters went on to become national names in the civil rights movement. Wouldn't the streaming platforms want to pick up on their histories, like follow them through Alabama? I don't, somebody's offering you a new idea, so I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, great. No, I mean it's a wonderful idea. I mean, unfortunately, so many of the people in the film are old. If they're, you know, if they're still with us, and there's you know, there I have a real sense of um for lack of a better word, like gratitude that I was able to film them when I did, you know, and because of the four main characters, Esther, Dion, Hank, and Helene. Helene died in January. Esther just turned, well, not just, actually, Esther is 101 and a half and is not necessarily like a great interview today. Um, and Hank Thomas is a double amputee and very frail. And, you know, it just, you know, it's no longer possible to get them in their power. Um, and so, you know, they're not going to be retracing any civil rights pilgrimages at all again.
Yeah, that's understandable. Um, how do audiences react to the imperative to see Jews as allies, as was said at the end of the film? That was one of the felt to me like one of the stronger messages at sort of at the end of the film there.
Um, I think that it's one of the stronger messages because I'm making a leap here because you're Jewish. I don't know that everybody who sees the film takes that as the takeaway. I think that Jews take that as the takeaway, and I think that other people may or may not. Um, how what's the question is it was it important? Why is it important? What was the question?
Like how do audiences react to that imperative?
Yeah, I mean, I think just like anything, I think audiences bring in their own experiences, their own perspectives, their own baggage. I think that um I mean, you know what, I don't even really want to say like this is how the Jews respond because I've heard Jews respond, you know, with great pride. I've heard Jews respond to that with anger. And I've also heard Jews respond with like the opposite, saying like, well, you know, for all of this positive portrayal, you know, you're kind of like making Jews out to be saints, and we weren't. And, you know, what about all of this negative stuff or places where Jews did not participate in the civil rights movement? So as I think as complex as Jewish, Black, anybody's involvement ever has been with anything, so has the audience reaction been.
Yeah, and it kind of also shows just the layer. There's so many layers to the story and people's involvement in it. So
Yeah.
have have the audiences been pretty diverse as you've seen them here?
Um, I have had the great fortune of being in Jewish film festivals and Black film festivals and being on the circuit for both. Um, that said, I think it's probably safe to say that a lot more Jews have seen this film than African Americans. Um, and that's for lots of reasons, starting with the fact of like who I am and the way that the film is being put out there. Um, Jewish film festivals are so much better resource than African American film festivals. I mean, they're often like run by one volunteer, whereas like, you know, I was at the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival, which if anybody has the chance should go because it's tremendous. I mean, they have over 100 films. There were 600 people in the audience for my film in a beautiful theater. I mean, everything was just so well done and so intentional. And actually, in fact, that was a film festival that did have a big Black presence in the audience. So part of it is the festival issue. And part of it is like, my film is playing actually through tomorrow night at the Avalon and at Fairfax Cinema Arts. It's also at AFI Silver Spring, but like it's basically in white neighborhoods, and or neighborhoods that are more accessible to Jews. So, so I have had the privilege of showing the film to Black audiences, but I think like at the end of the day, the breakdown is probably like 75% white, and not even just Jewish, 75% white and 25% Black, I would say.
Um, I have a couple more questions, but as we sort of come to a conclusion, I have a few that feel more conclusive in nature. So, like, what do you hope people will feel, no matter their background, after watching the film?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like there's two important takeaways, but and to me, I guess, starting with the fact that I don't think that I'm unusual in that the way that I learned about the civil rights movement was about like Martin Luther King and I Have a Dream, and maybe as I got a little older, John Lewis and Diane Nash. And in Hebrew school, I learned about Abraham Joshua Heschel being on the bridge with Martin Luther King, and eventually about the tragedy of Goodman and Schwerner and James Chaney. And that was like the extent. Those were probably all the people that I could have named, even like graduating college. Those are probably all the people that I could have named. And like it's sort of pathetic, but that is the way that we learn about historic movements. We never learn about regular people. We learn about the giants. And it's such a simplification, and it's also really a tremendous injustice to us, because besides the fact that we are not that there are all these people of courage whose praises we're not singing, besides that, we deny ourselves any kind of accessible role models, because like you can say like, okay, there's a problem, but like, hey, like I'm not Martin Luther King, I'm not Gandhi. That is so beyond my skill set, my spiritual path. Unless we learn about Hank and Dion and Helene and Esther, then we don't see ourselves in these heroes. And then we don't see how much opportunity we have every single day to become involved in social justice causes. And we don't see it not beyond that we also have the opportunity to make change. Like actually things can change because of our involvement. So that is one thing is I really want people to understand that the civil rights movement was made up of thousands of ordinary people who did not go to the bridge at Selma. They just stood up in their local amusement park, lunch counter, library, movie theater, segregated place. And then the other is that at the end of the day, these two groups of people, and again, to simplify it to this group of Howard students and this group of Jews, um, they got to know each other as individuals. It wasn't like you know, they were meeting the Jews or the Blacks. It was like a friendship between Helene and Hank, of like this moment of this person whose eyes you can look at and whose goals or dreams or background like you can identify with. And in individualizing um, connections, I think it creates empathy, in a way that talking about a group of people can't. It just by definition, it can't. And I mean, I'll just like tell you a little story that I learned from this. So Nancy Stoller is the woman in the film who's wearing the peace pajamas, and she's on the Golden Gate Bridge at the end of the film, and talks about how like she learned that her body is the most powerful political instrument that she had. Um, she, she stayed involved with the movement, and I think it was 1965 already when white people were less and less welcome. I would say even like we're being pushed out of the civil rights movement as Black Power was rising. Stokely Carmichael was the head of SNCC, at the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And, you know, Stokely was asked to recommend a new field secretary, a new SNCC field secretary in Arkansas. And he recommended his Jewish friend, Nancy Stoller, that he met on the picket line. Um, and you know, because of this like individual friendship, and she wasn't like necessarily like the white person or the Jewish person or whatever, she was the best person for the job and he knew her. And I think that is ir it's irreplaceable, those kinds of relationships and cultivating those kinds of relationships and nurturing them and maintaining them. And especially right now, while there's so much to disagree about, but just, you know, being able to connect to our friends is probably the most important thing and maybe the only thing that will save us.
Yeah, that was really beautifully said, like about about the film and about your vision for the film. And I really feel like that, you know, maybe in the moment I wasn't thinking about it, but it really does come across in your film. And I appreciate that message very much. And um, I feel like I would be remiss just to ask you as sort of a final question, what's up next for you or any future work that you're looking toward?
Yeah, I'm actually struggling with a film right now that I would like to finish. It's basically shot, but I need to edit it, and it's just again like the climate has changed so much. It's about the first, the principal dancer of Israel's national dance company, the Batsheva Dance Company, and her name is Rena Schenfeld, the dancer. And she is 85 and she's still dancing, and she is a force of nature and incredibly um, compelling and wise and graceful and um, surprising person to know who literally like grew up alongside and informed and was informed by the city of Tel Aviv. She was the only person in her family to be born in Tel Aviv um, in 1938 and 1939, excuse me. And you know, she saw Tel Aviv become, you know, what it is. And she has absolutely made an imprint on the artistic culture of Tel Aviv, and which has also made an imprint on her. So I'm working on that, but it's hard right now to make a film about somebody who is Israeli, even though it's hardly political at all. In fact, you know, if anything, it's kind of a universal story about an artist who happens to be Israeli.
Yeah, thank you. I hope hopefully that project will come to fruition and get the exposure it needs. I mean, even this project, our world is unfortunately in the state that it is, and these, I imagine, your upcoming project and this one, so much um, is a message that we all need to hear, and really, empathy and compassion for others and seeing them as people and friends. Um, like when they were dancing in, this the scene where they were dancing in together in the film. It was those moments. Hopefully, we can capture more of them in this world today. So I
Thank
just,
you.
yeah, and so thank you again for sharing your film and all of these wonderful messages. And um, thank you all out there for joining us and watching the film. And
Oh, I just want to say, like, if people want to find out more, there's a website which is ain'tnoback.com, without the apostrophe and ain't. And when we have screenings, when we're in local theaters, it's always listed there. And if you join the mailing list, which is an option there, or you want to bring the film to your community, you can do it through the website.
great, yeah, and we can send out, we'll send a follow-up tomorrow or the next day, and we can um, include, all that information, and maybe somebody out there will have the right connections to really get this out to wider audiences. So thank
And
you,
you
and
can still see it at the Avalon and Fairfax Cinema until through Thursday, and then AFI at least through June 12th. Thanks.
wonderful.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your day. Good night.
Night.